The Disability Services Act 1986 probably was an unpredictable event, but at the same time it was inevitable, and I'll explain those two strange realities. I think change in the disability area moves very slowly. It was a bizarre situation in the early mid-1980s that the Commonwealth, that had been primarily funding disability services, did not know how many people with disabilities there were in the country. They really didn't have a sense of what their money was being used for. It was a case of first in, first serve. If you were a traditional agency that had been around for a long time, sometimes 100 years, you got the funding first, and you might have got 100% funding, you might have got 80% funding. The newer kids on the block, well, the money wasn't there. Even if they wanted to run a traditional service, they couldn't get in. So I think that it was inevitable that we had some changes. The legislation at the time was the Handicapped Persons Assistance Act 1974, I think, and really that enabled the Commonwealth to fund sheltered workshops and predominantly nursing homes and activity training centres. So really a very narrow way of providing services to people with disability. Okay, the Handicap Programs Review was quite significant because clearly the government, and it was a Labor government at the time, which had a substantial social justice agenda, felt in some ways that they were up against the wall. I think there was some activism. There was there were pilot projects either funded by philanthropic organisations or indeed sometimes traditional agencies supported pilot projects that were radical, that were innovative, that ideologically made sense, but also were cheaper. At least the argument was run that they were cheaper. I think they were up against the wall, really, in many ways, to overhaul the existing legislation. The Handicap Programs Review was interesting because what happened was it was well funded. The Commonwealth and each of its state offices was in charge of undertaking quite extensive consultations, not just at the level of bureaucracy, not just at the level of the traditional service provider, but actually talking to people with disabilities and their families. It was an extraordinary event, and I to this day cannot think of any other event where the notion of government consultation was taken seriously and it wasn't tokenistic. I mean, there were problems in the sense that not everybody got heard, but there were multiple meeting dates at different locations. You could arrange, the Commonwealth's entourage of public servants and camera people and recorders would often come to an institution if people couldn't get out to those places. People could make written submissions. It was also an era where you could make submissions in different formats. Rather unique even still today, that people could send in taped testimonials or stuff in braille. I think, and people really felt that they were listened to and were engaged in the consultation process itself. And of course, consultation is dangerous because it also raises expectations. So I think the Handicapped Persons Program Review resulted in a report called New Directions. And there was a lovely summary document that was available that, in plain English, outlined some of the possibilities for change. And they were radical. I mean, the first significant thing was that no funding would be provided by the Commonwealth unless you could have your service conform to a particular philosophy. I think the other really unique thing about it was that in terms of the process of change is different groups came together to either support change or oppose it, and I think that's important. The groups that came together, people with disabilities, housing groups, accommodation groups, employment services, a whole coalition of people, parents groups came together, lawyers came together to support this process of change. I should say to you also was an era where there were a number of establishment agencies who were happy doing business in the old style, providing sheltered workshops, providing employment conditions where people earned 50 cents a day. I think it's important to remember those circumstances where there were no award wages, where there was no trade union protection. And of course there were institutions that still weren't providing basic necessities of life, proper food, proper diets, access to medical treatment, etc. A lot of those organisations were very threatened by the Disability Services Act when it came into being. And by the Handicaps Programs Review. They still believe that it was immoral almost to enable people with disabilities to take risks. One of the phrases at the time was dignity of risk, to take opportunities. A lot of those organisations felt that people with disabilities had to be protected. Some of those people actually actively opposed the change process, and, you know, as we hopefully will talk about a bit later, actually undermined the operation of that legislation. I think the other feature, you know, I was involved in this myself as a public servant, and I know you were, Alan, as well. We were recruited to, either from within the public service or outside of it, to be involved in this change process. Now, that's unique. Most, you know, when I teach Australian policy these days, we say that the bureaucracy is there to administer policies of government, not to shape and form them. In this situation, in fact, we were asked to almost be activists, to be true believers in spreading news about this new philosophy, assisting organisations to model their funding proposals in accordance with that philosophy. And, you know, looking back at it, taking even that one step further, we were even asked to assist organisations to rewrite their submissions so that their proposals would be acceptable to government in order to get new things funded.
So is that the style of approach where, for instance, CASSI would have been funded, would have been picked up by the Commonwealth Public Service? This is late sort of 1988, somewhere around there.
I think so. I mean, I'm not sure what happened in Queensland, but I think what we that there was a number of services that, and I'm using my language as against the official language. I think there were what we call the dud, never to be saved services that were so draconian. And again, they were the very draconian services that were, the buildings were not able to be transformed. The staffing mentalities, the very staffing structures, they might have just had doctors and nurses. Or people doing kind of very suspicious therapeutic kind of work. Then there were others that were kind of in between. Maybe the services needed to be broken up. I can remember the mantra was you weren't allowed to fund what we called whole of life services, so you had to break up accommodation and employment services. You had to split them up into distinct entities. And some of those organisations, it was changing their structures and changing the internal operations too. Individual program plans, you know, even strategic planning was a rather novel aspect at the time. There may have been other services like CASSI, for example, that hadn't been funded. Maybe there had been attempts to get them funded, and those services were funded with the new money. Sometimes organisations were forced to, and I say forced rather specifically, were forced to cooperate with other organisations in the region to get together, to talk to each other, to consolidate their activities, because in some areas they had no services, in other areas they had too many. Left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. So I think in the early stages there were services in transition from the old style to the new style, and you know, there were various kind of outcomes that had to be met as part of that transition process. There were deadlines, you might remember, at the time, and we all believed what was going to happen. I can't remember the date. Maybe I should have looked it up.
June 30, 1992.
June 30, 1992. That was going to be the kind of the grim reaper of the disability world death knock. That were these services, you know, going to be defunded? It would appear, certainly in terms of the legislation and the regulations that we were operating with, that they would be defunded. But we also know that there were some extremely powerful forces at the time behind those organisations, and the ALP probably at that stage was in its latter years, so there were obviously election issues as well at the time. So I think you know, there were many organisations. I think there's some lovely examples of organisations that did transit from the old to the new. I think in retrospect there were some that looked like they had made great leaps, but in fact it only just changed their name and changed the external ways of organising. And I think the good side of it is that with the Disability Services Act, which eventually came into being in 1986, is that there were a number of really new innovative services that were able to be funded and funded well. Not as many as I would have liked, but funded well, yeah. But again, when you realise, well, what is it about these places? And what I say to my students, it's not just about the bricks and mortar. These places shape and form who we are. I showed a video last week with mental health survivors, people in their 50s, 40s and 30s. A lot of those people have been in institutions in and out